Hello, this is Mark Schwartz, and this is a audio pre-lecture for the first ecology lecture for forest biology. Um, as you recall, I mentioned that I teach another class immediately before this class, and so I will be late to class, so I thought I would provide some of the lecture material via audio recording. So the four lectures in this forest biology segment on ecology are going to be these. One on the biogeography of woody species, then the community ecology of forests, disturbance ecology, and then ecosystem science. And in each of those, I will link the conversation to something to do with change in forests, like global threats to that forest biodiversity, and stressors like invasive species and climate change, altering forest community dynamics, um, how fire, particularly as a disturbance effect, um, changes forests, and then how do things like air pollution through nutrient deposition and acid rain affect forest ecosystems. So just a little bit more detail in this lecture. We're going to, this one here in particular, we're going to talk about tree diversity. How many trees are there? How many plants are there? How many different species? How are trees distributed phylogenetically across the clades of trees? What are the major clades of dominant trees? Um, what's the geographic distribution of trees? Where are there hotspots of tree diversity? And how diverse are different regions of the world? And then a bit about rarity and endemism. What are the hotspots of endemism in plants and trees? And where are the rare trees? So then in class, we'll talk about biomes, paleoecology, and how we understand how forests change through time, and how we might explain tree diversity both globally and within a forested system. So we'll start here. This is a diagram out of an introductory biology book and looks at species diversity. And on the left diagram, you can see that most species are animals, and those are mostly bacteria and insects. Sorry, they're mostly insects. Uh, and that you can see in the second center circle that most of those animals are insects, and that most of the then vertebrates are this is a vertebrate diagram. So anyway, the idea is that this is mostly invertebrates, and that plants represent about 15% of all species on Earth, and about 270,000 species according to this. Of course, estimates of how many plants there are varies. That Maberly in '97 said there were 250,000 of them. Prance in 2000 and Govarts in 2001 say 300 or over 400,000 species. How many trees? Different people have estimated this as well, 20,000 to 100,000. A more recent estimate is 100,000. But again, this is likely to change. And this is actually a rather phenomenal observation if you think about it, in that, when we think about large mammals, whales, well, anything, humans are actually a huge animal species, right? I mean, most animals are insects, arthropods, invertebrates, and even among vertebrates, humans are fairly large. And so if you think about anything the size of a human being, there's very few species that remain undescribed, or we think there's a very low rate of describing species. Although I saw in the news that they've recently described a new species of orangutan, but even in those cases are probably places where we knew the species, the population existed. We just did the genetics to discover them as a cryptic species. So you'd think that trees would be a similar sort of situation where they're large, and so we know where most of them are. But we continue to describe a lot of new species of trees, and we'll talk about why that is later. Okay, so there's tremendous variation in life history attributes among trees, and I think Dr. Z started the quarter asking you what is a tree, and we find that that definition is very difficult to get down very specifically, and he described it, I think, as something with secondary growth. But then that subsumes shrubs, and so there's variation in how one might define a tree. So there's variation in longevity. Some are very short, 5 to 10 years, and others are incredibly long-lived, over 5,000 years. They vary widely in height. up to 115 meters or so in height, and I think Dr. Z talked a bit about that, but also in girth. They're up to 16 meters in diameter in the African baobab. And then volume, giant sequoias are 1,487, can be 1,487 cubic meters of wood. So they can be they can be measured in size in various different ways, but B, also they can become very large, and yet we know not all trees are that large. And that they also vary in life histories, things like shade tolerance, and that there are trees that require 80% of full sunlight in order to thrive, and there are others that grow under the shade of other canopy trees and just 2 to 5% of sunlight. So there is a great diversity of trees. I'm sorry, these slides are reformatted, so these things are popping off the edge of the slides a bit. But trees span the entire plant kingdom. That there are ferns, gymnosperms and angiosperms that all contain trees. So there's tree ferns, there's lots of conifers and ginkgos and cycads, and then of course the angiosperms is where the largest number of trees are. But these come in both monocots and dicots. So let's think about the evolution of life for just a moment. That there are some key dates that life on Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and that we think photosynthesis started about 3.5 billion years ago. And by about 2 billion years ago, we had eukaryotic plants, or in other words, plants with organelles, with organs inside the cells. And that terrestrial plants then only erupted about 420 million years ago. These are things like Cooksonia during the Silurian age. But that trees are actually a very, very recent phenomenon, 360 million years ago, with lycopod trees in the late Devonian, and tree ferns about 300 million years ago, and conifers 220 million years ago, and angiosperms are only 100 or 150 million years in age. And so if you look at that on a table, we can see this here is here's the Silurian with the first plants that are starting to emerge onto the land, and then 200 million years ago we have ginkgos and some early conifers, and by the early gymnosperms rather, and then we have the flourishing of the conifers about 145 million years ago, and then at the end of this green band at the end of the Cretaceous or so, we have near the end of the Cretaceous, we have the emergence of the flowering plants and a huge diversification of plant families and through flowering. So the rise of the angiosperms is 100 and 150 million years ago. This was, I cut the bottom of the slide off, but it's from a paper by Crepet et al. In 2004. And what you see is that it's actually very difficult to sort out the phylogeny of plants, in part because the emergence of these families were all at about the same time. So if you're looking down where the blue arrow is, you see just an awful lot of numbers, where our estimate of when that family emerged was somewhere between 80 and 115 million years ago. And you can imagine that because they're erupting at very similar times, it's hard to place the branches in proper order along that phylogeny. Anyway, with molecular techniques, we've done quite a lot of that now, and we see this emergence of plant families that have trees in them along this last 100 million years. And so here's the part of that phylogeny, and what I'm really trying to, this is from the angiosperm phylogeny group, and I'm going to move this up just so you can see this. The main point here is that the little tree symbols over in the right, there are trees everywhere on this phylogenetic tree. So in other words, the idea of secondary growth and becoming a woody plant is something that's has erupted many times and all the way across the realm of vascular plants. And so there's just a lot of diversity in trees and across the phylogeny. So, well, we can think a bit about the biogeography of these trees by thinking where continents were 100 million years ago during this great diversification of trees. And so here is a depiction of the continents 120 million years ago, and you can see South America and Africa in the middle of the diagram near the equator, and that it's very difficult to pull out North America, but it's up to the north of South America, and you can see Greenland and what becomes Europe, and Asia seems fairly intact over there on the right. And that when this is where continents were when we have this great diversification, and we see that of plants, and we see that that the tropical parts of Africa and South America are actually in the tropics. That Asia, which becomes important, Southeast Asia, is near tropical, and that North America and Europe are in temperate regions. And that drives a lot of what we think about in terms of diversity of plant life and trees through time, or at least so we think. So if we look at the global diversity of some groups, things like the number of species of gymnosperms, here you can see a real center of diversity in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, places that are thought to have been in a sort of warm, temperate, subtropical environment for long periods of time. We have another area of diversification along the western United States and Mexico, and here we have a montane region with lots of heterogeneity in the environment that might be driving lots of local specialization and diversification. And then the Mediterranean basin has a large diversity as well. So when you can look at this with respect to individual groups, so here's the Pinales. This is where our pines and firs are, and they're up in the top in the Pinaceae. These are 220 to 250 species, mostly temperate, mostly in the northern hemisphere. And again, thinking back a couple slides, one of the things that we note is that here you are 120 million years ago, and what we recognize as being in the southern hemisphere is in the southern hemisphere at that time, and that it mostly remains in that southern hemisphere and biogeographically isolated from the northern hemisphere. For that entire time, we have diversification of these trees, and so we end up having very deep clades where you see the Pinaceae up here branching off from this group that contains the Ericaceae, the Phyllocladaceae, and the Podocarpaceae, which are all southern hemisphere species, the 19 genera of southern hemisphere podocarps, etc. And so we have this this deep division that divides the northern and the southern hemisphere that lasts throughout to today. Here's another graph that probably could use sliding up. So if you look at diversity within temperate, see this is global diversity species of vascular plants. Again, we see Southeast Asia and Indonesia being very rich in species, the neotropics and tropical Africa also being very rich in species, but also this western slope of North and South America in the subtropical region, and the Mediterranean basin as being particularly rich in species. And we all, as we know, the Mediterranean is a rich in plant diversity, generally, as are most Mediterranean climatic zones. But that one of the things that you see is that temperate forests have between 25 to 30 species of trees per hectare, where moist tropical forests can have upwards of 300 trees species per hectare. And so just a huge difference in diversity of forests in between temperate forests and tropical forests. Those temperate forests are actually moderately diverse. That often we see forests in California which might have 3 to 5 species of dominant trees, and then maybe a mixture of possibly 10 other species, but they tend to be fairly low diversity systems with respect to trees. So we can look at the geographic diversity of plants generally now and see that there's these patterns persist. That if you look at temperate Asia, there's something close to 70,000 species of plants known for temperate Asia, whereas North America has about half that number of species, and that is something that is notable through time and interesting, and we think it has a lot to do with the placement of Asia for for the past 120 million years versus the placement of uh, North America. That many of these places are, that if you think about China and the United States, they're at roughly comparable latitudes, but that they both have arid, dry regions and mountains and temperate to subtropical locations. But the diversity in China is just way, way higher than in North America. So this biogeography, these biogeographic breaks, the southern northern hemisphere, the different continents, and that the movement of those continents through time has led to different plant families becoming very species rich in different regions. And so, for example, the Fabaceae seems to have done quite well in many different places. It's the largest family of trees in the Neotropics and Africa, and right up there in Indo-Malaysia, which is misspelled, sorry to say. But yeah, you go to some place like Australia, which is this massive island that's been biogeographically isolated off by itself for a long, long period of time, and you get Proteaceae and Myrtaceae being up there with the Fabaceae is the largest three families, and you don't see those families being large families in any other part of the world. So there's some biogeographic variation in this diversification as well. Well, there's a lot of people who've done thinking about why temperate and tropical regions are different from one another with respect to species, and I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but just shortcut this discussion a little bit. You can pause the thing and look at the slide if you like, but basically the idea is that you can have high diversity because you have an increased speciation rate, a cradle sort of hypothesis, or you could have increased diversity because of a lower extinction rate, a museum kind of approach. And so people have looked at the age distributions of species in temperate versus tropic regions, and this is the OTT model down at the bottom that gets cut off a little bit, but the idea there is that both speciation is greater and extinction lower in tropical areas relative to temperate areas, and so that you end up with a doubled capacity, as it were, to increase diversity over temperate regions. And so we think that it could be age and the lack of glaciation. It could be relatively moist, stable climates. Could be physical features that drive these patterns. But the idea generally is that tropical regions have this capacity to build and retain more species, and that Southeast Asia is particularly species rich because of that. So there are all these evolutionary explanations where this higher temperature can also lead to higher to elevated mutation rates and shorter generation times. What's cut off on the bottom is there's also ecological explanations that warm temperature leads to more intense biotic interactions and thus greater selection for adaptations and specialization. These are all non-exclusive hypotheses and could be operating at different strengths in different systems, but they're all plausible, and they all favor the idea of speciation and being species rich in the tropical regions. But then we also have this idea of isolation, that this diagram shows Hadley cells up in the upper left, but this idea that warm tropical air with moisture rises up at the equator and then is pushed off of the equator either north or south, and that it drops all its moisture, and as it drops down to the surface of the earth again, it is very dry air. And so we have this preponderance of dry, arid and semi-arid systems at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south as a consequence of these Hadley cells and moisture patterns with that air movement. And so it also creates then biogeographic barriers in the same way that oceans and mountains can create biogeographic barriers, and that this isolation can lead to the diversification of unique floras. And so there are some then, oops, that's the slide I've had before. I didn't mean to have that slide in there. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So one of the things, that slide that I thought was going to be here and that I was going to talk about just to end this off in less than 20 minutes is that you can look at the diversity rates between China and North America, and family by family, you see that China has way more species than North America. Within different, we have about the same number of orders in China and in North America, but we have then slightly more families, but we have way more genera and way more species within these genera in the groups that are in China relative to North America, despite that we share just an awful lot of those genera across those different regions. Okay, I'll end it there and take that up and finish off the lecture in class on Thursday. Thanks.